Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today we have with us Miss Jowand Larrimore. You may know her husband. Her husband's name is Tim Larrimore. And if you've been a listener to the Better Together podcast, you might remember the state trooper who was shot on one occasion. That is her husband. So today, Miss Jowand is going to share from her perspective what that was like and a little bit about what it's like to be the wife of a pastor today. So Miss Jowand, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Dr. Moody. So it has to go back a long time ago. This happened in 1987.
Wow.
We had been in Orangeburg when he came out of the academy. That's where they sent us to. And that was about 3.5 hours from both of our hometown. And the night it happened, Heather was 1 week from being 3 months old. And it was late in the afternoon. It was probably getting close to 11 o'clock. And there was a knock at the door. And when I opened the door, there stood one of the patrolmen that had helped train my husband. His name was Gully, and he had his regular clothes on, and he just stood there and he said, "Jowand, where's Heather?" And I just kind of froze in the door jamb, and I said, "Gully, she's in the crib asleep." And he said, "I was working in my shop tonight, and I heard the scanner go off that Tim had been shot." And he called, and somebody came to him really fast. And as he's talking to me, all I could think about was Heather's never had a bottle.
Yeah.
She's never had formula. And all I could do was just, I see his lips are moving and I hear what he's saying, but I'm thinking, who am I going to give her to? I can't take her to the hospital. I don't know what I'm facing. And I think to myself, well, there were some bottles that we had from one of the showers, and I think the hospital gave us a couple of cans of formula. And I looked at him and I said, "Gully, tell me again what you just said." He said, "He's been shot twice." He said, "And when I heard the call come in, I jumped in my patrol car, and I went to the hospital. And I was there when they took him out of the ambulance. And he told me to come get you." And I looked at him and I said, "Gully, you're not lying to me, are you?" I said, "You really, really talked to him?" And he said, "Yes, Jowand, I talked to him." And I just kind of went into the auto mode and got those bottles, and I got those 2 cans of formula, and I put her an extra set of clothes in her diaper bag. And I just went and picked her up, and she was still asleep. And I held her in my lap. And we drove down the driveway, and our Allstate agent, Wayne and Rachel Lorick, they let us stay on their land the whole time we stayed there. They loved on us like we were their own. And we had just gotten back in church, and all I knew was Preacher Hannah and Miss Bernice Hannah and Wayne and Rachel and their 2 daughters and a couple of highway patrolmen, and that's all I knew in all of Orangeburg. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to walk in there and lay my baby on her couch and walk away. So I did. I walked in and I said, "Miss Rachel, I've got to go to the hospital. Tim's been shot." I said, "There's 2 bottles in there. They're still in the plastic, and there's 2 cans of formula." I said, "She's never had a bottle." I said, "Somebody will be in touch with you." And I remember getting in the car. And I don't think I was crying. I don't know if Gully said anything to me much, but it was just me and the Lord were kind of talking in my head. And when I got there to the hospital, he was in surgery. And I had made my first phone call to his parents. And I had said, "You need to come to Orangeburg to the hospital. Tim's been shot twice. He's in surgery." And I hung up the phone and I was calling my parents. And they came out and said, "You can go back and see him." And I just remember handing the phone to Gully, or I don't know if Preacher Hannah and Miss Bernice had made it there yet. It still was kind of blurry when I think back. And I remember walking into the emergency room where they had done the operation, and it was so stark white. And he was still laying on the table, and there was blood on the ground, on the floor, and kind of down his arms and stuff, and he had a little bit on his face. And he kind of grunted. He couldn't talk. He said, "I'm okay." And he was like, just pitiful. And we talked for a little bit. And then when I turned around, I just lost it when I got ready to walk out. So the Lord held me together pretty good through the hard part right there.
So let's stop and unpack that a little bit. You guys were young. I mean, our listeners, many of our listeners, it will be before they were born. And some of them may have a little trouble understanding there were no cell phones, per se. A couple of people had them in a bag and they didn't work all that great. So when you're talking about, you're calling, Preacher Hannah, you're calling Brother Tim's parents and your own, you had to get to an actual phone with the landline. So we got that going on. Yeah. The other thing I'm hoping our listeners are noticing, that Allstate agent, they just took your baby and took care of it. Gully did a good job. So he comes in and he's like, he knows you may not be able to think after this, so he wants to know where that baby's at. And he gets you to basically taken care of to get to the hospital. So all these people were the hands and feet, if you will, of the Lord, weren't they?
They were. I remember Preacher Hannah and Miss Bernice, he called us one day. When we moved to Orangeburg, there wasn't a Free Will Baptist Church in Orangeburg. And we had visited with Gully and a couple of the other patrolmen. But when you're used to Free Will Baptist doctrine, some of the things just didn't really line up the way we thought they should. So basically for a few months, we got out of church. Every time he would get a long weekend and we'd come home, we would go back to White Savannah and be with our church family there. But it was getting pretty serious as far as getting out of the Lord's will and on backsliding is what I would say it was happening. Just losing that relationship. And then my mom, Preacher Hannah, had came to Orangeburg, to White Savannah there in Conway. And she said, "My daughter's in Orangeburg, go find her." And he gave her our number. And so that they came to the house and we rededicated our life sitting at our kitchen table. So we had known them for maybe 4 or 5 months when this happened. And so to know that God would send somebody like that to our lives. And so we've never been a missionary per se, but when they were doing the itinerary and stuff, we went with them as much as we could, and they loved on us like we were theirs. And I cannot thank them enough for what they've done for us. Wow.
So they were helpful to you. This kind of pushed you guys, got you kind of back with the Lord, really got you on track, didn't it?
Well, we had gotten back right with the Lord prior to him getting shot. And he had been reading a book about this patrolman that had gotten shot and what he had experienced. And I told him, I said, "I know the Lord watched over you, but the knowledge that was in that book, it really was, it was so helpful." Yeah, so helpful to that night of what had happened. But when he got the chance to tell me what had happened, I can just, you close your eyes and you visualize being on the interstate that night. And I mean, he was 21, 22 years old. I was not even 20 yet. I was like two months shy of being 20 when this happened. And Heather was 1 week from being 3 months old.
Wow.
So you are in a situation where all you can do is depend on the Lord because your parents are so far away. And he told me that night, he said, "Jowand," he said, "all I could do was when I got back to my car was kneel in that door jamb and pray, God, I don't want to die. I've got a wife and a 3-month-old little baby girl home. I want to see them again." And for anybody that's out in the law enforcement. You don't have to go through it alone. God can help you be with you in those difficult times. And I just look back and, Blake wouldn't be here if the Lord had seen fit to take him that night. But he had better plans and more for us to do.
That's good. And so, many of our listeners are involved with law enforcement, and basically what I hear you saying to them, especially like the spouse of someone or that's got a son or daughter, you depend on the Lord and trust him, and that relationship needs to be what it should be.
Yes. The night that I think he stayed the first night kind of in a more high risk. I don't think it was ICU, but it was like an upgraded version. And they had put a tube into his lung because one of the bullets had punctured his lung and it had collapsed. So that's what he was in surgery for. And whenever they let me spend the night there, and I asked him, I said, is there a verse you want me to read? And it said, they intended evil against you. They imagined a mischievous device which they were not able to perform. And, for a young Christian, I got saved when I was 15. And then I got married. I turned 18 after I graduated high school. And church, was what we grew. And my grandma took me to church. And so I knew the Lord, but I heard a preacher say one time, he said, I felt my God a little bit deeper when the bad things happen. Yeah. And when life happens, you just feel him a little bit deeper. And you grow a little bit more closer to him when he's all you have to depend on.
And so you all were really learning about that, the book helped, and the verses, the scripture helped. And he didn't quit after he got shot. He did not say enough of that. He kept going, didn't he?
He did. He stayed on probably another 10 plus years until the Lord called him to preach. There's several times in his profession that when Heather was little, I remember we had prayed and got in the bed, and overwhelming feeling to pray again. And I said, Heather, we've got to get back out of the bed and let's pray for Daddy again. And she said, why, Mommy? We just prayed. And I said, I don't know, but I just let's pray. And we got on our knees, and I said, Lord, will you please don't send an angel? I said, but will you just ride in the car with him tonight while he's out on the road? And he said it was about that time that a drunk driver pulled out in front of him. And just situations after situations that the biggest, at that time, it was the biggest shootout in Orangeburg happened, and he was involved in that. And the Lord watched out for him and watched over him. And people used to say, Jowand, I bet you're just scared to death that your husband's a state trooper. And I said, I'm really not. I said, either God's big enough or he's not. I said, all the worrying that I can do, I said, I've learned to pray when God tells me to pray. But one of the verses that I learned early on is God's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And to know that no matter what I face in life, if a fear comes over me, that's not of God. And I can trust him. I can trust him with the good, and I can trust him when I'm scared. And when I don't understand what's happening, I can still trust him. And he's proven to be faithful.
And so that word you just gave us there is good for anyone that's struggling with fear at any particular point. You did make it clear, and I think you're alluding to that, you and Pastor Tim can go through your lives and think about events where I feel like I need to pray and something was happening, and you did that. So I think what I hear you saying is, anytime you feel like you need to pray for your spouse or your children or your parents or anyone else, stop and pray right then, and know they could be in some danger.
As a young Christian, after almost 4 years, the Lord let us go back to Horry County, which was adjacent to Marion County. They wouldn't let him go back to his home county. But when we got to go back, we went back to White Savannah, and he served on the deacon board, and I was Sunday school teacher. He was the adult teacher, and we sang in the choir and just different things, how the Lord let us get back involved in our church. And I remember it wasn't many Sundays after we had went back, Preacher Buddy C was preaching on intercessory prayer.
Mm.
And that was a word, you kind of hear it, but at that time you didn't really know exactly the depth of what that all entailed. And I remember going out the door and hugging his neck and tears just coming down my face. And I said, Preacher Buddy, that's what happened that night whenever Heather and I got back out of the bed to pray. And I said, I won't never forget that.
Yeah.
And the importance. When that feeling hits you, don't put it off, don't delay, act on it right then, because somebody's life could be in the balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so you all continued in law enforcement for some years, but wow, it seems like a long time. You've been at Liberty, and he's been pastoring, you've been ministering. What a different life, or is it?
Well, it's a lot different. We've been, if the Lord allows, Labor Day weekend, we'll start our 24th year. So we came that in like 99, right there around 2000. So we've seen a lot. We've seen a lot of God's goodness and his love displayed. It's had its ups and downs. You know how that is with the church family. You get attached to people and the Lord calls them home, or they move on to another town and the Lord uses them somewhere else. But it's been good.
It's been good, and similar. There are stresses as part of being a pastor's wife. There's stress that Brother Tim has dealt with. That's not like being on the side of interstate. But as you think about that, what are some things that that folks can do to better support the wife of their pastor and their pastor?
Well, that's a good question. Just treat them like regular and involve them. I remember a few years ago, the movie came out, and it was about a preacher's wife, and they were having a Bible study book, and they invited her to go out for a girls' night. And shortly after that, my daughter, she's Heather, the little girl that was in the beginning, she's 36 now. And so she has a huge group of girls her age, and if they ever do anything, they'll always call and say, Mama, you want to go? Or Miss Jowand, you want to go? And there was another group of ladies in our church. They asked me back to go see a Christian comedian lady, and just made me feel a part. Because sometimes they think, well, you're just too busy, or I don't want to bother you. But sometimes it gets lonely when they don't do that, So the little acts of kindness mean a lot.
They make a big difference, don't they? And so remembering it can be lonely. It can be difficult, especially after somebody you care about has passed away and you've been in the throes of ministry to them. And so don't forget your pastor's wife. Don't forget your pastor.
Yes.
And I think we've already picked up, but just to kind of reiterate it, to support that law enforcement family. Yes. Pray. And maybe even think about the relationship, making sure you've got a relationship with them and you're willing to help, just like those folks are willing to help you that night. They're willing to help at the drop of a hat, really.
Yeah.
Was there anything else we need to add? Pastor Tim's was a little bit longer. I don't know what to make of that, but that I think you've got it's pretty cool to see it from your side of I think you had the more difficult time, Miss Jowand, really, not knowing what was up. And that's what you were saying that night. You did talk to him. You're telling me the truth, right?
Yes.
So anything else you want to add before we sign off today?
I just want to thank you for having me, and for all those that are in law enforcement or you're a pastor's wife. My little saying is keep on keeping on. If you ever get an email or a text from me, I try to always tag keep on keeping on, because people are watching you, and let your light shine. Try to be sweet with your words and with your actions. And
even when it can be hard, right?
Do what?
Even when it can be hard to do.
Yes, it is. It's so hard, because I remember when you said that about, when you have a death. I remember about 6-7 months ago, there were 6 deaths within just a few weeks' time, whether they were our church or our personal family. And it was really, really hard to see Tim go through that, because not only was he preparing sermons, but he was just stretched so thin, and just the loss that he felt and I felt, it's like we had never been at that, that hard of a time.
Yeah.
Because it was like everybody around you was just hurting.
Yes.
But, so I'm thankful that God has like a refueling station, and he can fill you again with that joy and that peace, and that just want to keep on keeping on, because we're definitely living in a day and a time that we don't want to quit on him. And you see a lot of people being there. I mean, we just heard last week of a pastor saying, that he was done. And I'm just like, don't let it ever get that bad that that's something that would come out of your mouth.
Yes.
Ask for help. There's lifelines out there, and I appreciate that series of books that you do on the hurting, and there's help out there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Ms. Jowand. And I actually think this podcast will be helpful. I think it helps us to think a bit more about law enforcement, what they go through, and like you've talked about toward the end here, the pastor and his wife. And so I think you've done a lot, and I want to thank you for taking the time to share with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Moody.
And those of you who are listening, I want to thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And maybe you're a pastor or a pastor's wife that's hurting. I want you to know we do have help available to you. You can email us at questions@nafwb.org, and we can set you up where you can get counseling free of charge. So know that's something that we provide through the NAFWB, and we'd be glad to do it for you. Encourage you that are listening, share this with someone you know, maybe another law enforcement family, maybe others, to think about supporting their pastor and his wife, because every little thing we do truly does matter. It truly does help. We truly are better when we work together. Thank you for joining us today.